All right, so let me get you caught up with what we're doing. We are doing this series of stories in Genesis with the idea that, as they mentioned in the announcements, there are some bookmarks there in your worship folder with the idea that you would take those home and make sure sometime this week you are reading this story, because we have curated about 15 different stories from Genesis that we think everybody should know. We're not doing a verse by verse, chapter by chapter look at 15 stories we think everybody should know. So, especially with this would be a great opportunity. And if you haven't picked up right now, I mean, you can certainly go back most of the time, and you can look at that and with the different passages that we're doing. But last week we started the story of Noah and the flood with this, that God just said, you know what, we're going to flood this inhabited area and get rid of folks. And there's a very specific reason why. And he says, this is in our story last week, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe away from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. Ultimately, that he had gotten to the point that he had seen that people had gone so far away from God, that they were wicked, and every inclination of their heart was so wicked that they ended up saying, we have to do a reset. The thing I want us to understand before we look a lot at today's story, which is the story after the flood and when Noah gets out and he and his family and the promises there, but to understand what's happening in a way that maybe you haven't understood this before, is to understand that we are at war. We are at war with God. We as humanity declared war on him, certainly as early as Adam and Eve. I think that's important to understand. I remember talking to my grandfather. I was asking him, I said, you were growing up around the time of World War II. I said, do you remember, it's like, how did we as the United States, we were attacked by Japan, December 7th, 1941, we were attacked by Japan, and then we turn around and we go after Germany. Like, how did that work? Like, how did we go after Germany if Japan attacked us? And he's like, well, they were allies. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how that works. I mean, just because somebody's ally attacked you doesn't mean you go to attack them. Like, how does that work? Like, how did they talk about it? How did they justify it? Well, he had seemed to have forgotten, because I ended up looking it up later. Actually, on December 11th, 1941, Germany declared war on us. They had said, no, now's the time is ripe. We are going to declare war. And that made all the difference. We were now at war with Germany because they declared war on us. And we declared war on God. We need to understand it. We need to understand how that works, because when I talk to people about the fact that you and I and that we are at war with God, I have a lot of people, especially folks that aren't believers, that will just say, I've never declared war on God. I've never done that. So how am I at odds? So let me explain how we wage the war. What we do specifically. And what we do is we subvert the good. Remember, a few weeks back when we talked about creation, God was creating the heavens and the earth, and each of these days he said it was good. And when he said it was good, he meant aesthetically it was good. He meant that it was complete in some sense, but he also meant that it was morally good. Everything was in its proper place, that the things that needed to be separated were separated, that the things that needed to be filled were filled. It was all in a good place. And we went and subverted that with sin. Now, I need you to understand the term sin, the root of it is actually an archery term. It means a difference between where you're aiming and where you hit. That the difference between where you aim and where you hit is sin. So it's missing the mark. It's missing the goal and what it is that you are supposed to do. It is a deviation from what is. Let me see if I can explain this. Well, let me explain first. A couple different ways that we subvert that. The first, and this is the next blank in your outline, we engage in sins of commission, meaning we commit them, we do them. It's an act. We act out of concordance. We act contrary to what we know God wants. That was certainly the first sin that was recorded, where Adam and Eve end up eating of the fruit in Genesis 3. They knew God did not want that, but did that anyway. They did it because they did not like the place they were in. That good place where everything is where it's supposed to be. We as humans are in this particular spot in relation to all of creation to God, and decided we didn't want that. We wanted something different. Specifically here, the serpent in the temptation of Eve says, "For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." See, the temptation was they want to be like God. They didn't want to be in the place of humans. They wanted to be in this different place. They wanted to subvert that order by doing something different. And that desire that we don't want to be in the place that we're supposed to be is the root of all sin of commission, all sin that we do. Addiction, lust, greed, anger. We are constantly saying, no, I want more, or I want that, even though I don't have it. I desire to be in a different place, in a different state, regardless of what God says. That's what I long for. And the thing is, how do we then deal with the reality, the seeming contradiction that God says things are good, and yet they can also be sinful? Well, it's all the matter of perspective. I want you to imagine for a moment that there's a very, very large field. And at one end, the goal to which you would be trying to get is God. At one end is God, and that's your focus. And then He has all these other things in the field along with you. He has other people. He has the animals. He has things that we can do, that interactions and relationships we can have, that the way we would operate in life. And each of those things in the field are where they're supposed to be, and it's good. And if we keep our focus on God, if that is our mark, and we are interested in that, these other things in our peripheral vision at the side next to us, as we interact with them, and it's good. But as soon as we turn our focus from God to those things, and we begin to pursue good things as if they're the ultimate things, we begin to pursue a good feeling, we pursue anything, and we treat it as ultimate, and our move is that separation, that move from the mark that is God, and what we're focusing on, that distance is sin. That is the motion, that is the movement away from the perfect and the good. Let me give you an example. Right? Relationships can be really good. It is one of the wonderful things about human existence. In fact, when Jesus said, what is the greatest commandment? He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And the second is like it. See, he said there were two. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. That loving our neighbor, that being in connection, that being in relationship is important. But if we subvert that and say, no, the most important thing in my life is a relationship. I want to be married so badly that I am willing to dismiss the things that God says. I want to be connected to this person, so I'm no longer interested in God. And I am these kind of things, that whatever it is that we end up, they become our focus. That is a subversion of the order and the good. And it breaks things. That person cannot be God, cannot hold ultimate meaning. We are no longer focused where we should be. And things get messed up with these sins of commission. There's also, secondly, we engage in sins of omission. These are the things that we should do, but we don't. It can be as blatant as it's mentioned here in Romans. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. So they knew God, but they didn't give thanks to him. They didn't glorify him. They weren't interested in worshiping him. And because of that, their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. They know of God. They know that there's some idea of God out there, but they're not interested in it. They don't want to do it. They're busy doing other things or whatever, and it messes with them. They can't think straight. They can't feel straight. They become foolish and unwise, futile in their lives. There are things that you and I know we are to do. Things like generosity or faithfulness, being involved in a community of faith. And I think this is why some people think that they are not at war with God. Because it's not like they say, I'm actually actively committing these things to try to go against God, though I suspect they probably are. But that what happened is I'm not doing the things that I should be doing. I am committing these acts of omission, these things that if I were in my proper place, in community with people, in connection with God, in relation to the world, that I would naturally be doing. And because I don't do it, I'm at war. You realize even our apathy about God is a way of waging war against him and the goodness that he wants to create. In James, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. They have sinned because they know what they're supposed to do and they're not doing it. I mean, this can come in a couple different ways. We can just opt out of connection with God. We can opt out of the things we know we should be doing. But I think one of the ways that we in America are really good at doing this is we just do this when-then thinking. No. Right now is not a good time to do these things I'm supposed to do. You don't understand, Bill. I'm really busy right now. I can't be involved in community. Or things are really hard right now. I can't be generous. Or you don't understand, like things are crazy and the people around me are crazy, so I can't be faithful. Like we think, and so when this is solved, when these other things are solved, when I get older, when I finally get this job, when things clear up, when things aren't as hard, then I can do the things that I know that God wants of me. And we delay, but that delay is simply another form of apathy, another sin of omission. And we're waging war. The human race declared war on God and wages it this way by committing and omitting the things that we shouldn't do and that we should do, respectively. I'm pausing here for a second because I'm going to switch gears on us at one point. I'm talking about humanity generally. But I want you to see then how God wages his side of the war. And this is where we get into the story of what Noah is doing. You know, we have, because you might be asking, what does all this have to do with the flood and the promise? Let's look here at Genesis 9 to see how God, this is your next blank, by the way, how God wages the war. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my bow, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign, the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. At some level, I think it's important to understand that what God was doing with the flood was not necessarily a punishment, because people had gotten so bad that he needed to punish them necessarily. That may be part of it, but really, in many ways, God was doing a reset. We saw last week how the language was using, he was actually uncreating. He was resetting that humanity as a whole had gotten so off track that he needed to reset so that in the future things would be able, there would be a chance of connection and doing what it is that God had wanted. I mean, because he had Noah, right? He wasn't eliminating everybody. There's no indication that Noah was perfect. He was just blameless compared to the others of his generation. But he took Noah and his family, and he had this plan to begin with. So it was never about, let's get rid of humanity, as much as we need this reset and where we're going to go from here. But what does he do? He sets up this covenant, and it says he set his bow in the clouds. That word for rainbow in Hebrew is the word kashet, at least as far as I understand Hebrew, which is not a lot. But the word kashet actually means bow. Maybe some of your translations, as you read this, will just say, I set my bow in the sky. And when you think of setting the bow, what do you think of? I mean, if you're like me, I would have thought like, well, okay, like a Christmas bow, right? And the rainbow is like a bow in that sense. The word is the same as a bow from a bow and arrow. It is a weapon. That what God has done in how he wages war is he takes his bow and he says, I'm putting it aside. That every time we see the rainbow, we should remember the covenant. And God says he will remember the covenant, that he has just hung his bow, that his bow is there. He is no longer waging war against all of humanity. He is saying, I am not going to be doing it this way. We definitely are going to have this reset. He was clear about the reset, but this reset is done. We are now on a path for humanity to go forward, and you'll notice from this point on, as God continues and he still has wrath, he still has consequences for things, but it doesn't become global in nature. He deals with nations or families or individuals. He's dealing with regions, not this kind of more global sense of I am at war with humanity. In fact, as we will see later as we get to the New Testament, he actually declares his war on sin and death. But we get to choose. Though God has hung up his bow, has hung up his weapon, do we choose to remain his enemy, or do we want to join him? Because ultimately, in the last blank on your outline, how to join God's side. I think it's such a brilliant, I love the way Abraham Lincoln, apparently there was a letter back and forth, and people are saying, that you pray that God is on your side, and he says, I am less concerned with God being on my side and more concerned that we would be on God's side. Which I don't know how much that necessarily happened, but I think it's an amazing sentiment. The issue is not to say, hey, God, will you bless the things I want to do, and will you be on my side and the side of my family and my tribe and my nation? But instead, can we, as me and my family and our nation, can we be on your side? God set up a rainbow, and he said it was a covenant, a sign of a covenant. I think it's helpful to understand what covenant is. A covenant is like a contract. But a contract, if I have a contract with someone, that either of us can dissolve it by breaking it. So, I don't know, if I had a contract with somebody, say, to fix my roof. The contract is my side is I am going to pay them. Their side is they're going to fix the roof. And if one of us doesn't do that, then neither of us need to do it. If I don't pay him, he doesn't need to fix my roof. He doesn't fix my roof, I don't need to pay him. And, of course, we deal with courts and those kind of things in case one has lived up to theirs and the other didn't, and how we would do that. But that's the nature of a contract. It's broken by either party. A covenant, on the other hand, is to say, no. I'm going to do my side. You're going to do your side. And it's going to be that way. It's just going to happen. And by our faithfulness, and if one of us breaks that side, it doesn't absolve the other. There may be other punishments and things that have to happen because you broke your side, but it's not going to absolve the contract. And what God has done in his covenant is he says, I hang up my bow, I hang up my weapon against humanity. I will no longer be interested in just kind of this big reset of humanity. It's no longer about punishing all humanity. And instead, As I said, he's going to wage war on the issues of sin and death. But how did this start? When God set this covenant, what happened? And I think this is so key to understanding how we can join God and be on God's side. This is after Noah had gotten out of the ark, after the water had receded, and one of the first things he does, Noah built an altar to the Lord. And taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, before I get to that, I do need to point out, I think it's really fascinating, this idea that God smells and is pleased by the aroma. One of the things to understand is that for a lot of folks in the ancient world, what they believed is that the gods received their power because of the worship of people. That people would worship him and pay attention to him, they would become more powerful. If they didn't pay attention to him, they would be less powerful. There was this reciprocal understanding. But God's clear, like, he doesn't need our worship to be God. He doesn't need our worship to be powerful. But it is pleasing. He has an emotional response to our proper, ordered existence, but he doesn't need it. And he said in his heart, never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all the living creatures as I have done. He makes his covenant because Noah starts with worship. One of the fundamental pieces of what it takes for you and I to join God is worship. And worship involves a couple of different things. You know, we just sang about praising God and declaring holy and talking about his name. What were we doing there? Was it some ego stroke of God? He's like, just tell me I'm the man, right? Like he just wants to be boosted? It's not that. What it is when we worship, we participate in the order of creation that was meant to be in the first place, where we are the people of his pasture. He is our shepherd. He is our God. We are the people that recognizing that fundamental difference. We are not equals. We aren't like God. He is God and we are not. And fundamentally, worship is a part of that. It can involve that kind of praise and declaring his name. It can involve confession. Do you realize when we confess our brokenness that we say, Lord, I have sinned. Forgive me. I broke the things. There are sins that I have committed, and there are things that I should have done that I have omitted that have become sin. There are things I should be doing, and there are things I shouldn't be doing, and I mess it up. And not only am I that I realize I am breaking the world, and I'm also realizing that I'm broken. I am confessing, I am admitting that God is right. Those acts in and of themselves help us get to that place of the restored order of how creation is supposed to be. I mean, is it really that simple? That simply to join God's side, I just need to worship and confess? Sorta. I mean, it is now. It was extremely costly and extremely complex on God's side. When he hung up his bow, he didn't end his plan. He just said, I've got a whole different plan of how this is going to go. Specifically, I love this passage in Romans. For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Meaning Jesus Christ's death was meant to reconcile us, to bring us back, to reconnect us to God. And not only reconnect us to God, but reconnect us to the order of the universe that was always supposed to be. In the ways that we were reconciled through the death of Jesus, we are also reconciled, shall be now saved through the life and his resurrection. But notice that it says, while we were God's enemies. That God didn't wait for us to be perfect. God didn't say, I need you to make up for it all. He says, even while you are enemies, I will do the work to reconcile so that sin and death don't get to win. God has given us this promise that the image of Noah and what has happened, that Jesus is the ark that will save us, that the promise that comes, that's seen as the sign of the resurrection of Jesus, is the promise that we can overcome sin and death eventually with God. He has hung up his weapon. Will we? Let's pray. Gracious Lord, as I use that title, I think about the separate parts of it, the gracious part. The part that is not about giving us what we deserve, but giving us what we need, that your grace is shining upon us, that when you gave us your Son and he died in our stead, that you are there to make up, to self-sacrifice for the sake of overcoming the true enemy, sin and death, because even though we declare ourselves as enemies to you, you declare us your beloved. So, Lord, the truth is I have joined the opposing side. There's so many times that I fought against you, and I didn't even really think it as fighting against you. I just thought of it as I get what I want, or I don't have to do what I don't want to do. But each step along the way, I disorder things. And yet, you know that. And you have hung up your weapon, and you say, join me. Well, Lord, I'd be a fool. I'd be a fool to not give up what I can't keep, my life, this temporary thing. I give it to you. And instead gain something I can never lose, to be reconciled with you for eternity. Help me live that out day by day. And if I have to pray this prayer again because I mess up again, I'll just keep coming back to you. So that you're not only gracious, but you're my Lord. I pray that in Jesus' name. And all God's people said? Well, for a few moments, we'll have open worship. Get a chance to speak if God has something to lay on your heart, and I'll close this in a couple minutes.